Alright, so now before we get started, there are a few essential tools and materials that are not going to be included with the kit that you're going to need to source on your own and make sure you have available for when you start. Fortunately, these are pretty basic and doesn't amount to a very huge investment to get going. I mean, you could always spend a little bit more on quality tools and so forth, but for the most part, you can get away with mostly cheap Radio Shack stuff. Some of the main essential tools that you're going to need is a decent pair of needle nose pliers, something preferably thin and very easy to get into. It's good for clamping wires and holding them in place while you're soldering and so forth. They're quite handy. A pair of diagonal cutters. These are good for clipping wires and getting into tight places that are difficult to reach because they're flush on one end. A couple different size precision screwdrivers. A couple Phillips and a single flathead. Don't really need them, the flathead so to speak, but it is useful for certain applications that may pop up. A decent pair of fine tip tweezers. You're not really going to have much of a need for these unless you start doing some SMT stuff, but the kit isn't going to include anything that would require that. A couple decent pair of wire strippers and cutters. This is going to be for your wires for the 22 gauge and over, which will be used for power and the video line. And then a 22 gauge a 30 gauge stripper. You don't necessarily have to have this. Your teeth will work, but it's a lot easier to dial in the sizes that you need and just, how much you want to strip. So it's a consistency factor that's measured into this thing. But this guy is about $32 on its own. But you can just use the dial to dial in what gauge wire you want to strip. Some sort of razor knife, because you will be needing to scratch away some of the silk on the N64 board to mount certain components and wires. A decent but not overly expensive multimeter. Continuity and voltage readings are a must, so make sure that you have one that can do both of those. Hot glue gun, not for mounting anything, but mostly just for holding wiring down and things like that inside the case. And if anything I would suggest you don't skimp on is a decent soldering iron. This is going to really bug you if you can't actually dial in the temperature correctly, and there's nothing more frustrating than waiting for the solder to warm up while you've been holding it and trying to get it to actually take to whatever it is you're trying to wire up. That being said, as far as the wiring goes, a chemical pen, a flux pen, this stuff is great. I mean, it'll help you with mounting or soldering to the custom PCBs, and it's very good and almost essential for the 30 gauge wire, which is only a single strand and doesn't take solder very well unless it's pre-treated with this. And on the subject of the wire, you're going to need a real spool of 30 gauge American wire gauge AWG, and this is going to be used for your cart slot and controller wiring. It's very thin, it's very easy to work with, and you can tuck it out of the way pretty easily, and because it's single strand, it tends to hold its shape a little bit better. And then you're going to need 3 reels, or at least I recommend 3 reels, of 22 gauge wire for the power and the video feed. The power, I'd recommend getting a red spool and a black spool, and then a yellow spool just to keep consistency with the wire coloring. And 22 gauge I say use for the video just because it's a little less prone to interference. You could go as far as to get some shielded cable like you would get right out of the component cable from the system, but I think that's a little overkill, especially with the fact that it's not going any more than 6 or 8 inches as opposed to 6 to 10 feet. Adhesives, you're going to need some form to mount some of the components to the side and the casing. This Liquidite or Loctite liquid super glue is probably the best, but you got to be really quick with whatever it is you're working with, otherwise it's going to not work out so well for you. And yes, this will bond your hands together instantly, so I would be very cautious when using it. This is another form, but it's a gel, and it will allow you to have a little bit of extra time before the components that you're trying to glue together actually stick. But my personal favorite is this stuff called goop. I'm not sure if it's available outside the US or not. It might have a different name, but this stuff is amazing. It takes about an hour for it to cure, but once it does, it will never let go of whatever it is you're trying to bond. And the better part about it is that it stays pliable. So there's no way it's going to crack, there's no way it's going to let go. So this stuff is really good. I highly recommend it. And if you can get it outside the US, great. If not, some other equivalent super glue or maybe even this stuff is available. You're going to want to have a whole bunch of Q-tips on hand because they are very good for spreading this stuff specifically. Not so good for this stuff. And then, depending on how much of the casework you wanted to get into, you're going to want a decent file set. This one is a pretty cheap one that I got off of Harbor Freight, but they're awesome because they're diamond tip, or diamond grit, I should say. And it's just a whole variety, and I think it's $11 for the whole kit. And then, of course, our other essential, electrical tape. You'll be using a lot of this when you're covering up electrical joints or splices, and really is just a good thing to have on board because you can also use it as an insulator, which for certain parts of the project you're going to have to do. So those are some of the basics that you're going to need, and there's always a few other things that you could get, like if you wanted some heat shrink or something like that for your wire joints, but as far as essentials go, this is what you're going to need. So we'll move on to the next section, and we'll start going over the components of the system, what does what, and then start actually showing how some of these things are put together.